I never thought I'd find myself knee-deep in cobwebs and dust on a Saturday morning, sifting through decades of forgotten belongings in my grandfather's attic. He had passed away a few months earlier, and the task of clearing out his house fell to my mom, my 2 aunts, and me. They focused on the main living areas, while I volunteered to tackle the attic, thinking it would just be boxes of old clothes and broken furniture. The attic was exactly what you'd imagine, dimly lit, cramped, and filled with the smell of old wood. The first few hours were uneventful. I came across boxes labeled Christmas, tax documents, and Mom's china. It wasn't until I found an unmarked wooden chest pushed into a corner that my curiosity was truly piqued. The chest was locked, but the padlock was rusted and gave way easily with a little force. Inside, I found what looked like a time capsule, an old leather-bound journal, black and white photographs, and letters tied with a faded red ribbon. At first, I assumed it was all mundane. Maybe some of my grandfather's writings or mementos from his youth. But as I flipped through the journal, the entries revealed a side of him I never knew existed. The first few pages were dated in the early 1950s, written in his neat, deliberate handwriting. The entries spoke about a woman named Clara, a name I didn't recognize. The tone of the writing was tender, almost poetic, describing their meetings in secret and their plans for the future. The more I read, the more it became clear that Clara wasn't my grandmother. I paused, unsure if I should continue. The idea of reading something so personal made me uncomfortable, but my curiosity got the better of me. I needed to understand who Clara was and why my grandfather had kept this hidden. As I delved further, I pieced together a bittersweet story. Clara had been my grandfather's first love, someone he had met in his early 20s. They had been deeply in love but were separated due to societal pressures and family disapproval. The journal detailed their attempts to stay in touch, their hope that one day they could be together. But then came the most shocking revelation. Tucked between 2 pages was a photograph of Clara holding a baby my grandfather referred to as our son. I froze. A son? My grandfather had another child? I quickly went through the letters tied with the ribbon. They were from Clara, written years after the journal entries ended. In one of the letters, she explained that she had moved to another state and raised the boy on her own. She didn't want to disrupt my grandfather's life, especially after she learned he had married my grandmother. She assured him that their son was loved and well cared for. I sat there for what felt like hours, processing the weight of what I had just uncovered. My grandfather had a son none of us knew about. The next step was deciding what to do with this information. Should I tell my mom and her sisters? Should I try to find this unknown relative? Part of me felt like this wasn't my story to share, but another part of me felt an obligation to bring it to light. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing Clara and the baby, wondering what their lives had been like and how my grandfather had lived with this secret. I decided to tell my mom first, figuring she would know how to handle it. Her reaction was a mix of shock, sadness, and curiosity. She said it explained why her father had always been a little melancholic at times, especially around the holidays. Together, we decided to tell her sisters and see how they felt about digging deeper into this mystery. Over the next few weeks, we did some research. With the help of some online genealogy tools and the letters Clara had left, we managed to track down a man named Henry, my grandfather's son. He was in his 70s, living a quiet life in a small town a few states away. Reaching out to him was nerve-wracking. My mom wrote a letter explaining who we were and what we had found. Weeks went by without a response, and I started to think we might never hear from him. But then, one day, a letter arrived. Henry was shocked but open to meeting us. He had grown up knowing about my grandfather but never felt it was his place to disrupt our family. He had a family of his own, children and grandchildren, and was eager to connect. The first meeting was emotional. Henry looked so much like my grandfather that it took my mom's breath away. We spent hours sharing stories, photos, and memories. It turned out Henry had a lot of questions about his father, and we did our best to fill in the gaps. Over time, Henry became a part of our extended family. We visit him regularly, and he's even joined us for holidays. Learning about him and Clara has added a new layer to my understanding of who my grandfather was, a complex, loving man who had made difficult choices in his life. This experience taught me that family is never as simple as it seems. People carry secrets, make sacrifices, and live with regrets. It also showed me the importance of empathy and understanding. My grandfather wasn't perfect, but he was human, and now I feel closer to him than ever. So, if you ever find yourself in an attic, don't dismiss those dusty boxes. You never know what pieces of history might be waiting for you. Second story. I used to pride myself on being self-reliant, someone who didn't need help from others. Growing up in a small Midwestern town, I was taught that hard work and determination were the keys to success. By the time I turned 30, I had moved to Chicago, built a comfortable life for myself as a freelance graphic designer, and managed to stay relatively self-sufficient. But all of that changed one morning in October. It started as an ordinary day. The air was crisp, the trees painted in shades of orange and red, and the streets hummed with the usual city rhythm. I had made it a habit to walk to the nearby park each morning to clear my head before starting work. That day, I decided to stop by a local cafe first to grab a coffee. As I reached into my pocket to pay, my stomach dropped. I had left my wallet at home. "I'm so sorry," I stammered, feeling my face flush with embarrassment. The barista gave me a polite but disinterested smile. "No worries. Next time, maybe?" I was about to leave when the man behind me stepped forward. He was probably in his late 40s, with graying hair and a worn leather jacket. "I'll cover it," he said, sliding a $5 bill onto the counter. "Oh, no, I couldn't, don't worry about it," he interrupted, smiling. "Just pay it forward someday." I thanked him profusely, grabbed my coffee, and headed out. That's where most stories like this would end, but for me, it was just the beginning. On my walk home, I couldn't shake the interaction. It wasn't just the kindness of a stranger, it was the ease with which he had offered it, as if it was second nature. I decided to pay it forward sooner rather than later. The next morning, I returned to the cafe with the intention of buying someone else's coffee. But when I got there, the same man was at the counter. He looked surprised to see me. "Morning," he said, his tone warm but curious. "Morning," I replied. "I actually wanted to repay the favor you did for me yesterday." He chuckled. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," I said, "but it feels right." We ended up chatting outside the cafe for nearly an hour. His name was Ben, and he told me he worked as a mechanic at a nearby shop. He had grown up in Chicago, seen its highs and lows, and believed that small acts of kindness could ripple out in ways we couldn't imagine. "It's not about money," he said. "It's about connection." You'd be surprised how many people go through their day without a single meaningful interaction. Over the next few weeks, I started seeing Ben more frequently. Sometimes at the cafe, other times just around the neighborhood. We'd exchange pleasantries, and occasionally he'd share little nuggets of wisdom that stuck with me long after our conversations ended. Then, one particularly cold morning, I saw him sitting on a bench, looking more tired than usual. "You okay?" I asked, sitting down beside him. "Just a rough week," he admitted. "But it's nothing I can't handle." I didn't press him for details, but I offered to buy him a coffee this time. He smiled, and for the first time, I felt like I was genuinely helping him, not just returning a favor. A few months later, I learned that Ben had been quietly helping others in ways I hadn't imagined. He had a reputation in the neighborhood for fixing people's cars for little or no charge if they couldn't afford it. He'd also been known to drop off groceries for families who were struggling and lend an ear to anyone who needed to talk. When I confronted him about it, he just shrugged. Like I said, it's about connection. You'd be surprised how much a little kindness can change someone's day, or their life. That's when it hit me, Ben wasn't just talking about random acts of kindness, he was living it. And in doing so, he had inspired me to rethink my own approach to life. The last time I saw Ben was on a rainy evening in December. He was locking up his shop, and I stopped to say hello. "I'm moving," he told me, catching me off guard. "Moving? Where to?" "Back to Michigan. My mom's getting older, and she needs someone around." I nodded, feeling a pang of sadness, but also admiration. It was just like Ben to put someone else's needs before his own. Before we parted ways, he handed me a small, folded piece of paper. "Keep this," he said. "And don't forget what we talked about." When I got home, I unfolded the paper. It was a simple note that read, "Every small act matters. Never underestimate what you can do for someone." It's been over a year since Ben left, but I think about him often. His words and actions left a lasting impression on me, and I've tried to carry on his philosophy in my own life. Every time I help a stranger, offer a kind word, or simply listen, I feel like I'm keeping his legacy alive. And maybe, just maybe, the ripples of those small acts will reach someone else who needs them, just like they reached me. Third story. I've always been someone who sticks to routines. Monday through Friday, I worked my predictable 9 to 5, went to the gym, and spent weekends running errands and catching up on laundry. Life was steady, if uninspired, and I thought I liked it that way. That was until a seemingly trivial mistake at my local grocery store threw everything off course. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was rushing through the aisles, ticking items off my list. By the time I reached the checkout line, the store was unusually packed. The cashier was flustered, the bagging line moved at a snail's pace, and I was ready to escape the chaos. When I finally reached my car and started unloading my bags, I noticed a bag that wasn't mine, an assortment of items I didn't purchase, a loaf of artisan bread, a jar of orange marmalade, a small pot of rosemary, and a box of organic teas. I debated returning to the store but decided against it. The line had been long enough the first time, and I wasn't up for the hassle. Instead, I figured it was someone else's mistake and resolved to keep the items, figuring I might even try the tea. The next day, I was sorting through the groceries when I noticed a small folded receipt tucked into the bag. Scrawled on the back was a note: "If found, please call 555 for 829134. Thank you. Mrs. Eleanor Barker." I hesitated. Returning a bag of groceries wasn't exactly thrilling, but I'd feel guilty keeping them without trying to contact the owner. When I called the number, a warm, slightly shaky voice answered. Eleanor Barker sounded delighted that I'd found her items and asked if I could drop them off. She explained that she didn't drive much anymore and offered to make tea if I came by. I almost said no. I didn't know this woman, and it felt strange agreeing to visit a stranger. But something about her voice was so genuine, so kind, that I agreed. Eleanor lived in a small house about 15 minutes from mine. Her garden was immaculate, filled with vibrant flowers and fragrant herbs. She opened the door with a smile, a petite woman in her late 70s with sparkling eyes and an energy that belied her age. We sat in her cozy kitchen, where she insisted on making tea from the box I'd inadvertently taken home. Over steaming cups, she told me about her life, how she'd moved to the city after retiring, her late husband who had been a carpenter, and her children who visited only occasionally. She seemed happy, but there was a hint of loneliness in her stories. That first visit lasted 2 hours. Before I left, she handed me a jar of marmalade, insisting I try it. "It's my favorite," she said. "Spread it on warm toast, and it'll brighten your morning." I didn't expect to see Eleanor again, but a week later, I found myself thinking about her as I made breakfast. The marmalade was delicious, just as she'd said, and I realized I'd enjoyed our conversation far more than I'd anticipated. On a whim, I decided to call her. From that day on, Eleanor and I began meeting regularly. Sometimes I'd visit her house for tea, other times, we'd go for walks in the park near her home. She had a way of making even the simplest outings feel special, always pointing out small details I would have otherwise missed, the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, or the scent of honeysuckle blooming in the air. Over time, Eleanor became a close friend, someone I could talk to about anything. She gave me advice about work, relationships, and even gardening, which I eventually picked up as a hobby. She often joked that she'd adopted me, though it felt more like we'd adopted each other. The most surprising thing Eleanor taught me was how to slow down and appreciate life. Before meeting her, I'd rushed through my days without pausing to enjoy the little things. With her, I learned the value of quiet moments, of sharing stories, and savoring life's small pleasures. About a year after that first grocery store mix-up, Eleanor passed away. It wasn't sudden. She'd been candid about her health and made peace with the inevitable. She left me a letter, thanking me for our friendship and asking me to take care of her garden. I still visit her house, now my house. I couldn't bear the thought of anyone else living there, so I bought it from her family. Her garden thrives under my care, and every morning, I spread marmalade on toast and think of her. What started as a mistake turned into one of the most meaningful connections of my life. I'll always be grateful for that bag of groceries and the warm, vibrant woman who came with it.